The wooden platform trembled beneath the worn boots of Eleanor. Laughter, thick and cruel, rolled through the dust-choked square as the wooden gavel struck the barrel with a violent crack. The corrupt town official waved a stained piece of paper high in the biting autumn wind. It was a debt contract, representing 5 years of indentured labor, bundled as a miserable public joke with the most worthless parcel of rock in the entire territory. That parcel was the dried-up, barren earth known simply as Dead Man Creek. Eleanor stood entirely exposed on the raised planks, the freezing air slicing through the faded green cotton of her coarse dress. She deliberately turned her scarred left cheek away from the sneering faces of the crowd below, her hands gripping the rough fabric of her apron to stop their violent trembling. They were laughing at her. A 32-year-old seamstress with a fuller, sturdy figure and a face marked by childhood fire, being auctioned off alongside dead dirt. It was the ultimate humiliation, a public spectacle designed to strip away her remaining humanity. But the truth of why a certain massive, shadowed figure stood at the edge of that laughing crowd was far more complicated than anyone in that miserable town could have ever imagined. Stay with me until the very end of this journey to uncover the deep secret buried beneath that barren land. Hit that like button and comment what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels around the world. I have seen many harsh winters and many cruel men in my time. But there is a special kind of wickedness in treating a gentle human soul like a discarded commodity. The world can be a terribly cold place when a woman is left without a family and without a protector. Eleanor knew that bitter cold intimately. The terrible fire of her childhood had taken her parents and permanently marked her face, leaving her to the harsh mercy of a society that saw her only as a burden to be tolerated. The town official, a man with a sharp nose and a heart resembling a rusted nail, paced the wooden platform like a victorious predator. He shouted out the miserable price, mocking the heavy build of Eleanor, loudly declaring her a fitting beast of burden for a farm entirely made of stones. The cruelty of the crowd was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of the poor woman. Yet, she did not weep. A subtle, recurring habit anchored her spirit. She smoothed the rough hem of her apron with her thumb and forefinger, lifting her chin just a fraction toward the gray sky. Quiet dignity was the absolute only possession she had left in the world. Then, the laughter in the square suddenly died. The amusement did not slowly fade. It was abruptly choked out by the heavy, dragging sound of a massive boot scraping against the dry earth. The crowd physically parted, pulling back in silent apprehension as a towering figure stepped from the deep shadows of the livery stable. It was Harrison. He was a mountain of a man, 38 years of age, with shoulders wide enough to block out the weak afternoon sun. He walked with a severe, permanent limp, the brutal and lasting reminder of a cattle stampede that had shattered his leg and pushed him into a life of deep, voluntary isolation. The town pitied the ruined leg of the man, but they deeply feared the man himself. The thick beard of the cattle foreman was dark and heavily streaked with early gray, his sun-weathered face entirely unreadable. He wore a rugged canvas coat dusted with the dirt of the trail, and his presence carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a silent storm. The town official visibly stammered, his mocking tone evaporating into thin air as the giant approached the wooden platform. Harrison did not look at the crowd. He did not spare a single glance for the trembling official. The piercing, deep-set blue eyes of the mountain man locked entirely on the frightened, scarred face of Eleanor. For the very first time in the entire life of the seamstress, the gaze of a man did not flinch away from the deep burn on her cheek. Instead, those steady eyes held a strange, quiet reverence. As if he were looking at something incredibly precious, rather than something broken. It was the first true beat of warmth in a deeply frozen, miserable day. The silent respect in the eyes of Harrison wrapped around her battered spirit, offering a brief moment of profound shelter. Harrison reached into the heavy pocket of his faded canvas coat. He drew out a thick leather pouch and tossed it heavily onto the wooden barrel. The heavy, metallic clanking sound of solid gold coins silenced any remaining whispers in the dusty square. The corrupt official scrambled to open the pouch and count the money, his greedy fingers shaking uncontrollably under the fierce, silent glare of the massive cowboy. The debt was paid in full. Barren wasteland of Dead Man Creek and the labor contract of the overlooked seamstress now belonged entirely to the quietest, most intimidating man in the entire valley. Eleanor stood absolutely frozen on the elevated planks. The autumn wind howled once again, whipping her skirts and threatening to push her off balance. Harrison stepped closer to the platform, his massive frame deliberately moving to position itself directly between Eleanor and the biting wind. He used his broad shoulders to shield her from the harshness of the freezing weather and the cruel, staring eyes of the town. It was a subtle, wordless movement, but it was a profound act of public protection. A second beat of warmth washed over the trembling woman, thawing the edges of her terror. She fully expected him to bark an order, to treat her like the livestock he had just purchased, to demand she climb down and fetch his horses. Instead, Harrison remained perfectly silent, waiting patiently for her to step down at her own pace. When she finally descended the wooden stairs, her legs shaking from the cold and the sheer shock of the moment, she found herself standing in the massive shadow of the silent protector. He was easily a foot taller than her, a rugged monument of a man. The scent of worn leather, dry pine, and clean earth surrounded him, offering a third, unexpected beat of comforting warmth. He did not grab her arm. He did not rush her. He slowly turned toward the back of a battered wooden wagon, parked near the livery. He reached into the wooden bed of the wagon and retrieved a thick, heavy winter coat lined with sheep wool. With slow, remarkably gentle movements, he turned back to the trembling seamstress and held the heavy garment out to her. He did not speak a single word, but the silent offering carried an emotional weight far heavier than the gold he had just emptied onto the barrel. Eleanor stared at the massive, calloused hands, offering her survival against the incoming winter. The rough leather of the coat smelled of safety. Why would a man who actively avoided every living soul in the county, a man who lived high in the lonely ridges, suddenly descend into town to purchase a completely worthless patch of dead dirt and a deeply scarred, discarded outcast? She slowly wrapped her trembling fingers around the heavy wool, terrified of what the coming night would reveal. Eleanor pulled the heavy sheepskin coat tightly around her trembling shoulders. The thick wool held the residual warmth of the massive mountain man, wrapping her in an unfamiliar shell of absolute safety. Harrison turned his broad back and walked toward the front of the heavy wooden wagon, his severe limp causing a rhythmic dip in his heavy, determined stride. He did not issue a single command. He did not demand that she load the meager supplies, nor did he order her to tie the weary horses. The expectation of harsh servitude was deeply ingrained in the mind of the gentle seamstress, a terrible survival instinct forged through years of bitter cruelty and endless public humiliation. Yet, as she climbed onto the rough wooden bench of the wagon, the giant simply waited until she was fully settled before taking the thick leather reins in his heavily calloused hands. The heavy wheels of the wagon lurched forward, leaving the sneering faces of the town officials to fade entirely into the biting autumn wind. The journey to the very desolate edge of the county had officially begun. In the fragile heart of the outcast, a profound, terrifying curiosity began to replace the immediate, suffocating panic. She was traveling into the absolute unknown, guarded by a man who moved like a quiet mountain. The trail leading away from the harsh settlement was brutal and entirely unforgiving. The rhythmic, bone-jarring rattle of the heavy wooden wheels over deep, frozen ruts echoed through the vast emptiness of the desolate plains. The expansive sky above them bruised into a dark, stormy purple as the weak afternoon sun bled into a freezing evening. The bitter wind whipped across the barren flatland, stinging the exposed skin of the weary travelers. Eleanor fully expected the silent cowboy to curse the bitter weather or to loudly lament the miserable condition of the dirt road. Instead, the stoic composure of Harrison remained absolute. He guided the heavy draft horses with a steady, masterful grace, his piercing blue eyes fixed entirely on the distant, jagged horizon. The absolute silence stretching between them was immense and heavy. In the difficult past of Eleanor, silence always meant an impending punishment, a cruel trick, or a quiet rejection. However, the heavy silence of the massive cattle foreman felt profoundly different. It was not a hidden weapon waiting to strike. It was a sturdy, quiet wall built deliberately to keep the chaotic cruelty of the outside world at a remarkably safe distance. As the temperature plummeted deeper into the night, the brutal cold began to seep through the sturdy leather boots of Eleanor. She unconsciously engaged in her subtle, recurring habit. Her thumb and forefinger began to rhythmically smooth the heavy hem of the borrowed coat, seeking desperate comfort in the tactile reality of the thick wool. Harrison noticed the small, nervous movement out of the corner of his eye. He pulled back on the heavy leather reins, bringing the massive wagon to a gentle halt in the middle of the desolate trail. Eleanor immediately tensed her tired shoulders, bracing her scarred cheek for a sudden, angry rebuke regarding the delay. Instead, the giant reached behind the rough wooden bench and retrieved a thick, heavy woven Navajo blanket. Without speaking a single syllable, he meticulously draped the heavy blanket over the freezing lap of Eleanor, carefully tucking the rough edges around her boots to completely seal out the biting wind. It was a gesture of quiet, shocking dignity. He did not look at her with the familiar sting of pity. He simply observed a physical vulnerability and immediately moved his massive hands to completely shield it. The first true, undeniable warmth of the long journey bloomed deeply in the weary chest of the gentle woman. The harsh miles stretched endlessly as the pitch-black darkness fully claimed the rugged frontier landscape. The grueling nature of the wagon ride took a highly visible toll on the massive frame of the silent protector. The severe limp indicated a deeply ruined leg, and sitting rigidly on the hard wooden bench for endless hours clearly caused him agonizing, silent discomfort. Yet, an impenetrable stoic mask hid the depths of his physical pain. When they finally reached a shallow, frozen stream, Harrison stopped the wagon to rest the exhausted draft horses. Eleanor immediately moved to climb down and fetch the heavy water buckets, fully believing this was the hard labor he expected from his newly purchased commodity. The massive hand of Harrison gently caught the edge of her woven blanket, stopping her movement completely. He shook his head slowly, his deep voice rumbling softly like distant mountain thunder. "Stay in the warmth. I will tend to the team." Eleanor sat absolutely frozen on the wooden bench, utterly stunned. She watched the massive man climb down heavily into the freezing mud, dragging his ruined leg as he hauled heavy wooden buckets of freezing water from the icy stream. He was doing the brutal labor himself, actively protecting her from the harsh, biting elements. She was not a miserable burden to him. She was a gentle guest. This profound realization fundamentally shifted the very foundation of her fearful assumptions. When Harrison finally returned to the heavy wooden bench, the freezing wind dramatically shifted, howling down from the jagged northern ridges with a violent, piercing intensity. As he settled heavily beside her, he deliberately adjusted his seated position. The massive cowboy shifted his broad shoulders to the direct windward side of the bench, acting as a human shield against the bitter gale. The freezing draft that had been slicing cruelly across the scarred left cheek of Eleanor was instantly blocked by the towering frame of the silent giant. He offered her a tin canteen of fresh water, waiting patiently until she took a long, desperate drink before he allowed himself to take a single sip. True strength, Eleanor realized in the deep, freezing darkness, was not the loud ability to force weaker souls into fearful submission. True strength was the quiet, absolute willingness to absorb the brutal hardship of the world so that someone smaller could simply breathe without fear. The profound emotional distance between them remained entirely intact, but the immediate and suffocating terror of the seamstress had entirely melted away, replaced instead by a deep, quiet, and lasting awe. The bright moon hung cold, like a silver coin in the black sky, by the time the heavy wagon finally turned off the main trail. They had reached the absolute boundary of the county, arriving at the desolate patch of freezing earth, known entirely as Dead Man Creek. The heavy wagon crested a low dirt ridge, and the pale moonlight completely illuminated the destination they had traveled so far to reach. Eleanor leaned forward, peering through the freezing darkness to finally see her new home. A sudden, terrible weight dropped deeply into her stomach. The small timber cabin sat at the bottom of the rocky depression, completely silent and entirely broken. The heavy winter snows of the previous year had completely collapsed the eastern side of the roof, crushing the supporting timber walls into a jagged pile of rotted wood. Half of the small dwelling was entirely open to the violent, freezing wind, forcing a dangerous, deadly exposure to the ruthless winter elements. The bitter cold of the desolate frontier pressed heavily against the ruined timber walls. The terrifying sight of the collapsed cabin would have completely broken the fragile spirit of a weaker woman. Half of the wooden roof lay in splintered ruin across the frozen dirt floor, leaving a massive, gaping wound in the eastern side of the small structure. The howling wind of the freezing night tore ruthlessly through the exposed gap, threatening to freeze the blood of anyone foolish enough to step inside the dark ruin. Death by exposure was a very real, very immediate threat in the harsh wilderness. Harrison pulled back on the heavy leather reins, bringing the exhausted draft horses to a complete stop. He climbed down heavily from the wooden bench of the wagon, his massive frame moving with grim, silent determination despite the agonizing drag of his ruined leg. He walked slowly to the side of the wagon and simply held up his large, calloused hands toward the scarred seamstress. He did not issue a loud command. He merely offered his absolute physical support. Eleanor placed the trembling hands of a deeply fearful outcast into the massive, steady palms of the silent protector, letting him guide her safely to the frozen ground. They stepped together into the chaotic wreckage of the cabin. It was a vivid sensory assault. The smell of damp rot, deep frost, old dust, and dry pine needles filled the freezing air. The interior was a highly dangerous mess of heavy fallen beams and sharp, scattered debris. The wind screamed through the open timbers, biting cruelly into the exposed skin of the weary travelers. Eleanor knew with absolute certainty they would not survive the long night if the freezing wind continued to rip entirely unchecked through the open wall. The instinct to cower and wait for a harsh command flared briefly in the mind of the scarred woman, but the absolute necessity of warmth burned far brighter. For the very first time in many years, the quiet survival instincts of the gentle underdog roared to life. She recognized a terrible, massive tear in the fabric of their shelter, and a seasoned seamstress knew exactly how to mend a broken seam. She did not wait for the giant to give her instructions. She moved swiftly back outside to the heavy wagon, her sturdy boots crunching loudly against the frozen earth. She pulled down the massive, heavy canvas tarp originally used to cover the meager supplies of the rancher. The thick fabric was incredibly stiff with the biting cold, extraordinarily heavy, and completely unmanageable for a single, small person. She dragged the heavy canvas toward the ruined doorway of the cabin, her breath pluming in white clouds. Harrison immediately saw her quiet struggle. He crossed the broken room in 3 massive strides, taking the immense weight of the thick canvas into his powerful arms. He looked down at her, his piercing blue eyes filled with a quiet, intense question. "Hold the thick corners to the surviving ceiling beams," she murmured, her voice steady and entirely clear, despite the violent shaking of her frozen jaw. The towering cattle foreman nodded exactly once. He reached high above his head, his broad shoulders straining powerfully as he hoisted the heavy canvas against the violent, pushing wind. Eleanor pulled a thick iron needle and heavy leather twine from the deep pockets of her coarse dress. While the giant held the heavy fabric in perfectly steady place, she moved with astonishing speed and absolute precision. Her scarred fingers flew bravely in the freezing dark, pushing the thick needle deeply through the stiff canvas. She stitched the heavy fabric directly around the exposed timber beams of the ceiling, creating a taut, impenetrable windbreak. Her thumb and forefinger instinctively smoothed the rough edge of the thick canvas as she worked, her subtle, recurring habit grounding her deeply in the chaotic, terrifying moment. The freezing wind pushed violently against the heavy canvas wall, but the meticulous, desperate stitches of the seamstress held perfectly firm. Harrison moved the heavy, fallen logs, clearing the dangerous debris away from the stone hearth with brutal physical effort. As he worked, he stood deliberately between the freezing draft, slipping under the door and the smaller frame of Eleanor, intentionally absorbing the worst of the cold while she finished tying the final knots. It was a remarkably subtle beat of warmth, a quiet, profound continuation of his absolute physical protection. Within an hour, the chaotic interior of the ruined cabin was entirely transformed. The heavy canvas wall blocked the deadly wind completely. The profound stillness inside the newly sheltered space was a massive physical relief. Harrison struck a wooden match against the rough stone of the hearth, igniting a small pile of dry kindling he had meticulously salvaged from the broken roof. The golden, warm light of the growing fire danced gracefully across the dirt floor, illuminating the exhausted faces of the 2 survivors. The towering mountain man turned his head, his deep-set eyes locking entirely onto the scarred face of the sturdy woman. He looked quietly at the perfectly stitched canvas wall, and then he looked deeply back at the exhausted seamstress. The absolute, undeniable respect in his steady gaze was overwhelming. They had survived the deadly freezing darkness entirely, through unspoken, equal cooperation. It was a second beat of warmth, powerful enough to melt the deep, bitter ice of her lingering fears. Eleanor sat carefully on a salvaged wooden crate near the glowing hearth. She stared deeply into the flickering orange flames, a profound emotional reflection taking strong root deep within her weary heart. For her entire life, the cruel townspeople had called her a totally useless burden. They had mercilessly mocked her fuller figure and turned away in absolute disgust from the visible burn scar on her left cheek. Yet, in the desolate, vast, freezing darkness of Dead Man Creek, her capable hands had just literally saved both of their lives. Her unique, overlooked skills as a homemaker and a seamstress had stitched together a physical wall against the deadly winter. She was not a worthless, discarded commodity. She was a woman of immense value, entirely capable of creating vital warmth from absolute ruin. The beautiful realization was a quiet, soaring victory in the battered soul of the underdog. Harrison stepped softly toward the bright fire. He held a small tin cup filled with boiling water and fragrant dried pine needles. He knelt heavily on his good knee, bringing his massive frame down directly to the eye level of the seated woman. He gently placed the hot tin cup directly into the freezing hands of Eleanor. His rough, calloused fingers briefly brushed against her trembling knuckles, lingering just a fraction of a second longer than strictly necessary. It was a third, incredibly tender beat of warmth. The massive, beige, intimidating giant was offering her the very first cup of tea in their new home, making absolutely sure she was warmed before he tended to his own deep exhaustion. The long, brutal night slowly surrendered to the pale, gray light of the creeping dawn. The violent storm completely passed, leaving a heavy, peaceful silence over the desolate valley. The weak morning sun filtered softly through the small cracks in the intact timber walls, casting pale golden rays of light across the dirt floor. The bright beams directly illuminated the exact spot where Harrison had dragged the heaviest, rotting logs away from the center of the room. Eleanor set down her empty tin cup. She stood slowly, her weary muscles aching deeply from the grueling labor of the previous night. She walked cautiously toward the cleared section of the dirt floor. The heavy dragging of the massive logs had completely scraped away a thick layer of hardened earth, revealing a small, hidden hollow perfectly concealed beneath the broken floorboards. She knelt in the cold dust, her breath catching sharply in her throat. Resting inside the shallow dirt depression was a small, incredibly ornate wooden box. The polished dark mahogany was heavily carved with intricate, twisting vines and blooming roses, a beautiful object completely out of place in the barren ruin of the frontier cabin. Eleanor reached out with trembling fingers, brushing the thick dust away from the beautiful lid. She tugged gently at the small brass latch, but it did not move even a fraction. The small wooden box was locked entirely tight, keeping the deep, silent secrets of Dead Man Creek safely hidden in the frozen earth. The mysterious wooden box sat quietly on the rough stone mantel of the hearth, its intricate carvings catching the warm light of the dancing flames. The locked mahogany secret was a silent witness to the profound, quiet transformation slowly occurring within the walls of the broken timber dwelling. As the harsh winter slowly bled into the bitter, lingering chill of early spring, a steady, deeply comforting rhythm settled into the daily lives of the unlikely companions. Trust is a remarkable, highly delicate thing in the unforgiving frontier. It cannot be forced into existence by a loud command, nor can it be instantly purchased with a heavy pouch of solid gold. True trust must be meticulously built, piece by tiny piece, through the absolute consistency of quiet, meaningful actions. Eleanor took quiet, steady command of the domestic survival of their fragile sanctuary. She gathered the deeply worn, tattered clothing of the massive cattle foreman, The heavy canvas coat and the faded denim work shirts carried the heavy, pungent scent of old dust, dried horse sweat, and endless miles of lonely trail. She scrubbed the heavy fabrics in a large iron pot of boiling water, her scarred knuckles turning bright pink from the harsh heat. While the garments dried near the open flames of the stone hearth, she sat close to the warm light, her skilled fingers working a thick iron needle through the heavy denim. The vivid sensory sound of the rough, coarse thread pulling tightly through the heavy fabric filled the quiet room. As she worked, she noticed a severe, distinct pattern of heavy wear on the clothing of the mountain man. The right leg of the faded denim trousers was deeply frayed and violently torn along the outer seam. It was a profound physical map of his silent agony, a direct result of the heavy, dragging limp that plagued his daily steps. A deep, aching compassion filled the chest of the gentle seamstress. She did not simply patch the massive tear. She meticulously layered thick, heavy canvas over the damaged denim, reinforcing the entire right leg with incredibly tight, unbreakable stitches. She was intentionally creating a thick armor against the harsh brush of the valley, a physical shield to protect the ruined leg of the giant from further painful injury. When Harrison returned from the freezing creek, she quietly handed the folded garments toward his massive chest. He took the heavy trousers, his piercing blue eyes immediately locking on to the meticulous, reinforced stitching. He slowly ran his rough, heavily calloused thumb over the perfectly straight seam. He looked up, the absolute gratitude in his steady gaze striking her like a physical blow. It was the first true beat of warmth in the passing week, a silent, profound acknowledgement of her deep care. He did not utter a single syllable, but the absolute reverence in his eyes spoke entirely volumes to the battered soul of the underdog. In the days that followed, the sharp, rhythmic scraping of a heavy steel drawknife peeling bark filled the small valley. The vivid, powerful scent of fresh, raw pine sap completely overpowered the old smell of damp rot inside the broken dwelling. Harrison gathered the most sturdy, unbroken timber from the ruined sections of the old structure. He worked with brutal, relentless physical effort, completely ignoring the visible tightening of the muscles in his jaw as his ruined leg loudly protested the heavy labor. He was not repairing the external walls or fixing the broken corral outside. He was meticulously cutting heavy wooden planks, fitting them together with absolute precision inside the sheltered room. Eleanor watched in quiet awe as the massive frame of a sturdy, elevated bed took shape in the absolute warmest corner of the small room, directly beside the glowing stone hearth. The giant gathered huge armfuls of dry, sweet-smelling prairie grass, stuffing the soft material tightly into a massive canvas sack to create a thick, comfortable mattress. He placed the heavy sack onto the sturdy wooden slats, smoothing the rough wrinkles with his massive, dirt-stained hands. It was an astonishing, monumental act of physical labor, dedicated entirely to the physical comfort of a woman the rest of the world considered absolute trash. It was a second, overwhelming beat of profound warmth. The massive protector was actively ensuring the scarred woman would never have to sleep on the freezing dirt again. As the deep darkness of the evening fully claimed the barren valley, Eleanor prepared for the night. She fully expected the towering master of the property to claim the comfortable, newly built bed. After all, his massive body was deeply scarred and heavily burdened by daily physical pain. Instead, the silent giant retrieved his heavy woven Navajo blanket. He walked to the exact opposite side of the small cabin. He spread the heavy wool directly over the hard, freezing dirt floor, positioning his massive sleeping form entirely across the heavy wooden doorway. He was deliberately making his own body a physical barricade, ensuring absolutely nothing could enter the sanctuary to harm the gentle seamstress. It was a third, absolute beat of unbelievable warmth. Eleanor sat carefully on the edge of the soft canvas mattress. The dry prairie grass rustled gently beneath her full figure. She raised her trembling right hand, engaging in her subtle, recurring habit. She rubbed her thumb and forefinger rhythmically against the rough hem of her faded apron, her warm hazel eyes locking onto the massive, sleeping form of the stoic protector. A deep, profound emotional reflection blossomed in the quiet space beneath her ribs. For 32 years, the cruel society of the town had demanded she shrink herself, demanding she endlessly apologize for her sturdy figure and the deep burn scar on her left cheek. Yet, inside this isolated timber ruin, she was treated as something highly precious. Emotional safety, she finally realized, did not arrive through grand romantic speeches. Emotional safety was a sturdy wooden bed built by calloused hands. It was silent, scent, absolute willingness of a deeply wounded man to sleep on the freezing dirt, simply ensure a scarred woman could rest comfortably near the fire. The deep, heavy ice of her lifelong terror finally began to crack completely, allowing the very first, fragile green shoots of genuine trust to push upward toward the gentle light. But the fragile peace of the hidden valley was violently temporary. On the morning of the 12th day, the pale winter sun completely vanished. The weak light was suddenly swallowed by a massive, bruised yellow darkness spreading rapidly across the northern sky. The quiet morning birds stopped singing, replaced by an eerie, heavy, and absolutely terrifying silence. Eleanor stepped onto the small wooden porch, the dry air suddenly tasting deeply of heavy copper and ancient dirt. She looked toward the high ridge. A massive, towering wall of churning brown earth was rapidly blotting out the entire horizon. It was a severe, violent dust storm, a brutal wall of suffocating dirt moving with terrifying speed directly toward the fragile cabin, threatening to rip the newly mended canvas roof completely off the heavy timbers and bury them both alive. The violent wall of churning earth slammed into the small timber structure with the deafening, brutal roar of a derailed freight train. The heavy wooden door buckled violently inward, groaning in absolute agony under the immense, crushing weight of the howling tempest. Total darkness instantly consumed the small interior space. The weak winter sunlight was completely obliterated by the suffocating blanket of heavy brown dirt, forcing its way through every tiny crack in the timber walls. The air inside the cabin immediately grew incredibly thick, biting the lungs with the harsh, dry taste of ancient copper and crushed stone. The entire foundation of the fragile sanctuary trembled, completely overwhelmed by the terrifying power of the untamed frontier. Harrison moved with explosive, desperate speed. He threw his massive bulk directly against the heavy wooden door, his thick boots digging deeply into the rough dirt floor. The violent wind screamed like a wounded animal, pushing back against the broad shoulders of the mountain man with a terrifying, unrelenting force. The thick leather hinges of the heavy door shrieked in loud protest, threatening to snap completely and allow the deadly storm to rip the interior of the cabin into splintered ruin. "Stay near the hearth," roared the deep voice of the giant over the deafening chaos. It was a direct, forceful command meant entirely for her absolute physical safety. It was the very first undeniable beat of warmth amidst the terrifying darkness. A fierce, protective instinct prioritizing her continued life far above his own physical limits. But the brutal reality of his deeply ruined leg quickly became highly apparent in the violent struggle. The heavy, its agonizing drag of his old injury prevented his right boot from finding a firm, the unyielding purchase in the loose soil of the floor. His massive frame began to slowly slide backward under the relentless, crushing pressure of the violent gale. The heavy wooden door pushed violently inward, another terrifying inch, allowing a massive blast of blinding sand to whip across the small room. Eleanor stood frozen near the glowing stones, her warm hazel eyes wide with absolute terror. She clearly saw the immense physical strain, trembling through the massive shoulders of the silent protector. The cruel society of her past had constantly drilled a harsh, unforgiving lesson into her gentle mind. Women of her sturdy, neat, fuller build were clumsy, entirely useless, and highly unwanted in moments of serious crisis. But the desperate survival instinct of the scarred underdog completely overrode the deeply ingrained fear. She engaged in her subtle, recurring habit precisely once, her trembling thumb violently smoothing the rough hem of her apron before she abandoned the temporary safety of the fire completely. She rushed across the dark, chaotic room. She did not hesitate to enter the absolute center of the danger. Eleanor stepped directly behind the towering cattle foreman. She wrapped her sturdy arms completely around the thick waist of the giant, pressing her full figure tightly against his broad, severely strained back. She planted her sturdy leather boots heavily into the dirt floor, dropping her center of gravity to create a solid, immovable anchor behind him. She squeezed her arms tightly around his midsection, lending every single ounce of her physical strength to the desperate battle against the violent wind. The sudden, deeply unexpected physical proximity sent a massive jolt of raw shock through the rigid spine of Harrison. He stiffened instantly against her hold. He was a deeply guarded man who had lived completely isolated for years, avoiding all human touch, actively hiding his ruined body from the cruel, pitying eyes of the entire world. Yet, the gentle seamstress did not shrink away from the harsh reality of his physical struggle. She pressed her scarred cheek directly against the heavy canvas coat of his broad back, entirely ignoring the flying dirt, stinging her skin and the violet noise surrounding them. "I have you," she breathed firmly against the heavy roar of the raging wind. The towering giant did not push her away. He did not reject her desperate, clinging assistance. Instead, he let out a harsh, deep breath, heavily leaning his massive weight back into the sturdy, comforting hold of the gentle woman. It was a second, profound beat of unbelievable emotional warmth. He was actively accepting her immense strength, allowing his deeply guarded soul to be entirely physically vulnerable in a moment of absolute crisis. Together, wet, locked in a tight, desperate embrace, they formed an unbreakable human barricade against the destruction of the outside world. The heavy door stopped sliding backward. The combined weight of the stoic protector and the incredibly sturdy underdog held the violent wrath of nature at an absolute, unyielding standstill, as the violent storm raged brutally outside the timber walls. A deep, profound, emotional reflection washed over the beating heart of Eleanor. Her arms were wrapped tightly around the most intimidating man she had ever known, feeling the heavy, steady thud of his racing heart beneath his thick coat. For 32 years, the cruel world had loudly called her heavy body a miserable, unsightly flaw. Yet, in this terrifying, absolute life-or-death struggle, her sturdy figure was not a clumsy burden. It was the exact physical anchor saving the life of the very man who had purchased her from a cruel public joke. Her physical substance was not a terrible curse. It was a deeply vital, highly valuable strength. The brutal tempest battered the small cabin for 2 endless, terrifying hours. The heavy dust coated their hair, filled their burning eyes, and layered their clothing in a thick blanket of fine brown powder. Yet, they did not move a single inch away from each other. The quiet, shared physical endurance slowly melted away the final heavy walls of their profound emotional distance. Finally, the violent screaming of the wind began to slowly fade, shifting into a low, hollow moan before dying away entirely into the vast emptiness of the desolate valley. The immense, crushing pressure against the heavy timber door suddenly vanished completely. Harrison slowly relaxed his massive, aching shoulders. He turned his heavy body slowly, remaining entirely within the close physical space of her sturdy arms. He looked down into the deeply dirt-smudged face of the exhausted woman. The pale light filtering through the dusty cracks illuminated the soft, profound admiration shining clearly in his deep-set blue eyes. He reached up with a massive, trembling hand. With unbelievable gentleness, he used his heavily calloused thumb to carefully wipe the heavy layer of dust away from the deep burn scar on her left cheek. It was a third, utterly shattering beat of emotional warmth. He was not looking past her scar. He was actively, deeply tending to it. They stepped slowly away from the heavy door, their muscles screaming in absolute physical exhaustion. Harrison pulled the heavy wooden latch backward and pushed the door wide open. The thick air outside was deeply still, the violent dust having completely scoured the barren landscape of the dead valley. The weak sun cast long, strange shadows across the radically altered terrain. They walked carefully onto the small, wooden porch, coughing the dry dust from their lungs. Eleanor stopped entirely short, her hazel eyes locking onto the center of the barren yard. The violent, howling wind of the storm had relentlessly peeled away a massive, thick layer of the hardened topsoil. In the exact center of the dirt yard, directly where only dry rock had existed the day before, a large, deep circular depression had completely caved inward. A highly distinct, unmistakable smell rose from the newly exposed earth, completely changing the very nature of their desolate existence. It was the rich, heavy, unmistakable scent of deeply damp soil, hinting at an impossible, life-changing secret buried directly beneath the barren dirt. The heavy iron shovel struck the dark earth with a dull, heavy thud. Harrison drove the thick metal blade downward with immense, steady power. He completely ignored the agonizing protest of his ruined leg. The violent dust storm had radically altered the terrain of the barren yard, stripping away the hardened, useless topsoil to reveal a deep, circular depression of strangely dark mud. The vivid sensory smell of damp earth was an impossible miracle in the center of the desolate frontier. The towering cattle foreman dug with relentless, happed rhythm, throwing heavy clumps of wet soil over the edge of the newly formed crater. Eleanor stood safely on the edge of the depression, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She engaged perfectly in her subtle, recurring habit. Her trembling thumb and forefinger moved rhythmically to smooth the rough hem of her faded apron. She watched the massive shoulders of the silent protector rise and fall with heavy, exhausted effort. Suddenly, the heavy iron blade struck something deeply solid. A loud, sharp ring of metal against smooth stone echoed through the quiet valley. Harrison stopped completely. He dropped the heavy shovel into the dark mud and fell heavily onto his good knee. He reached his massive, calloused hands directly into the deep soil, pulling away a heavy, flat rock. The vivid sensory sound of rushing liquid immediately filled the absolute silence of the afternoon. A thick, powerful stream of freezing, crystal clear water erupted from the dark earth. It bubbled wildly over the dark stones, washing away the heavy mud and rapidly filling the deep basin with absolute purity. It was an underground spring, hidden deep beneath the dead dirt for countless generations, entirely trapped until the violent tempest and the desperate labor of the giant finally set it free. Harrison did not drink. He plunged his massive, dirt-stained hands deep into the freezing pool. He cupped his heavy palms together, lifting a generous amount of the clear, shimmering liquid into the cold air. He stood slowly, his severe limp dragging heavily as he walked directly toward the scarred seamstress. He held his massive hands out to her, offering the absolute first drink of the miracle to the gentle woman. It was a profound, deeply moving beat of warmth. He had done the brutal labor, but he prioritized her complete nourishment above his own deep thirst. Eleanor leaned forward carefully. She placed her trembling hands gently over the thick wrists of the mountain man to steady the heavy water. She lowered her scarred face and drank deeply from his calloused palms. The water was incredibly sweet, painfully cold, and tasted of deep, pure life. She gasped softly as the freezing liquid slid down her parched throat, pulling back to look directly into the deep-set blue eyes of the stoic giant. A profound emotional reflection immediately took heavy root within the gentle soul of the underdog. For her entire life, the cruel society of the town had completely dismissed her. They had sold her as a miserable joke alongside this exact piece of barren, dead land. They believed both the scarred woman and the rocky dirt were entirely devoid of value. Yet, beneath the harsh, deeply scarred surface of Dead Man Creek, an absolute abundance of pure, life-giving water waited patiently to be found. The salvation in the barren place was a beautiful, magnificent mirror of her own deeply wounded heart. She was not a ruined commodity. She, exactly like the hidden spring, possessed a deep, quiet well of immense value, requiring only the patient hands of someone willing to look beneath the damaged surface. A genuine, radiant smile broke completely across the weary face of Eleanor. The beautiful joy completely transformed her features, making the deep burn scar on her left cheek entirely insignificant. The pure, unadulterated happiness of the scarred woman struck the towering giant like a heavy physical blow. Harrison stared at her, utterly mesmerized. He had lived in deep, lonely shadows for so many bitter years, completely hiding his ruined body from the cruel world. Seeing the absolute joy of the gentle woman bloom so brightly in the dead valley was a second, overwhelming beat of profound warmth. He slowly wiped his wet hands against the heavy canvas of his coat, his rigid jaw completely softening as a rare, incredibly gentle expression settled into his weathered face. "We have water," breathed the seamstress, her voice trembling with intense joy. "The valley is alive." The massive mountain man turned his heavy head back toward the bubbling spring. The crystal pool was overflowing rapidly, sending a thin, silver ribbon of pure water trailing down the dry slope toward the withered brush. Dead Man Creek was no longer a miserable, useless patch of frontier rock. It was suddenly a massive, life-sustaining oasis in the brutal cattle country of the western plains. A pure, running spring was worth more than a deep vein of solid gold. The brief, beautiful moment of shared triumph violently shattered. The stoic mask instantly slammed back over the weathered face of Harrison. The gentle warmth vanished completely from his deep-set eyes, instantly replaced by a dark, intense shadow of sudden terror. He understood the ruthless, greedy nature of the corrupt men who controlled the territory. The town official had sold the land believing it was a complete, worthless joke. The moment the corrupt men discovered the miraculous spring, They would use every single violent, illegal method at their disposal to take the land back. Harrison turned his massive frame completely toward Eleanor. He stepped directly into her personal space, raising his heavy right hand to gently grasp her sturdy shoulder. It was a third, fiercely protective beat of warmth. The grip of the giant was heavy, anchoring her firmly to the earth, silently vowing to defend their fragile sanctuary against the entire world. The sudden, intense fear of loss gripped them both heavily. They finally had something incredibly precious, and the cruel society they had escaped would undoubtedly try to tear it away. A low, rhythmic rumble vibrated deeply through the heavy dirt beneath their boots. It was not the lingering thunder of the past storm. It was the distinct, heavy sound of running horses. Harrison turned his broad shoulders swiftly toward the eastern ridge. His hand instinctively dropped toward the heavy leather holster strapped to his thick thigh. The weak afternoon sun illuminated the jagged crest of the high hill. 5 dark, intimidating silhouettes appeared against the pale, bruised sky. They were riders, moving with aggressive, deliberate speed directly toward the hidden valley. At the very front of the approaching group, a long, dark flag fluttered violently in the biting wind. It carried the unmistakable, bright red crest of the corrupt town official. The outside world had not forgotten the cruel joke, and the brutal men were coming to completely shatter the delicate peace of the broken cabin. The heavy hooves of the 5 imposing horses struck the damp earth with brutal, thundering violence. The vivid sensory sound of clanking iron spurs, shifting leather saddles, and heavily breathing animals completely shattered the quiet peace of the newly awakened oasis. The sharp, bitter scent of heated horse sweat violently clashed with the pure, clean smell of the bubbling spring water. The 5 riders formed a highly intimidating wall of muscle and steel, stopping precisely at the edge of the deep water basin. The corrupt town official sat highly elevated upon his massive black stallion, his cruel eyes wide with absolute, uncontrolled shock. He stared entirely fixated at the impossible miracle of pure water flowing generously over the barren rocks. His sharp, rat-like features rapidly twisted from pure astonishment into deep, calculating greed. The worthless joke of a dirt farm was instantly the most valuable property in the entire Western Territory. The official yanked violently on the thick leather reins of his horse. The massive beast sidestepped aggressively, kicking heavy clumps of dark mud directly toward the gentle seamstress. Harrison moved with explosive, terrifying speed. He stepped squarely between the aggressively moving stallion and the deeply frightened woman. The towering cattle foreman did not draw his heavy weapon, but his massive hands balled into highly lethal, tight fists at his sides. He positioned his broad shoulders to completely block the harsh, greedy gaze of the mounted men. It was the absolute first beat of profound warmth in the sudden chaos. He was actively throwing his own massive body into the direct line of violent danger to ensure her complete physical safety. The official sneered coldly, pulling a tightly rolled parchment from the inside pocket of his heavy coat. He pointed a heavily gloved finger directly at the stoic face of the silent protector. "There has been a severe clerical error regarding the transfer of this property," sneered the corrupt man, his voice dripping with heavy, undisguised malice. The deed of Deadman Creek was incorrectly bundled. The auction was strictly for the indentured labor contract of the scarred woman. The land remains the official property of the town council. The lie was absolute and completely transparent. The corrupt men simply wanted the highly valuable water, and they were perfectly willing to use brute force to steal it back. "The gold was paid," rumbled the deep, dangerous voice of Harrison. "The transaction is complete." Get off my land. The official laughed. A sharp, highly grating sound echoing across the desolate valley. He leaned heavily over the horn of his leather saddle, his cruel eyes locking directly onto the trembling figure of Eleanor, hiding behind the broad back of the giant. You cannot hold the deed of the land through a temporary labor contract, mocked the official. The law of the territory is completely clear. If you refuse to return the deed, the labor contract of the woman is instantly revoked. My men will place her in heavy iron restraints right now and drag her back to town to serve her original debt in the laundry houses. You will be entirely alone on a dead dirt farm. Eleanor stood absolutely frozen, her warm hazel eyes wide with sudden, suffocating terror. She engaged immediately in her subtle, recurring habit. Her trembling thumb and forefinger rapidly, desperately smoothed the rough hem of her faded apron. A deep, highly painful emotional reflection crashed violently over her battered spirit. The beautiful salvation of the underground spring was nothing but a cruel illusion. She was still a discarded, highly vulnerable commodity. The corrupt society still viewed her entirely as a piece of dirty paper to be violently traded, stolen, or forcefully dragged away. The deep, heavy dread threatened to pull her completely under the dark water of her past trauma. Harrison did not turn his head. He did not look back at the trembling woman. He stepped one single, highly deliberate pace forward. He looked directly up into the cruel face of the mounted official. The piercing blue eyes of the mountain man were entirely devoid of fear. You cannot revoke her labor contract, stated the towering giant, his deep voice carrying the heavy, immovable weight of an absolute mountain. And you cannot seize the deed of this land. The official frowned deeply, his gloved hand moving slowly toward the heavy revolver resting at his hip. And exactly what legal right gives a crippled hermit the authority to defy the town council. The homestead law of this territory completely protects the primary residence of a legally united family, Harrison declared, his steady voice rising loudly over the howling afternoon wind. The labor contract of the woman is permanently nullified. I am taking Eleanor as my legal, wedded wife. The profound paradigm shift struck the open air like a massive bolt of invisible lightning. Eleanor gasped sharply, her sturdy hands flying up to cover her scarred cheek. The temporary, highly fragile arrangement of survival had just violently transformed into a permanent, terrifying, and deeply profound commitment. He was not simply protecting a purchased worker. He was, legally, publicly elevating the deeply scarred underdog to the highest, most respected position a woman could hold in the harsh frontier. It was an absolute, shattering second beat of warmth. The silent giant was actively binding his entirely isolated life directly to her deeply broken one, choosing a permanent union simply to save her from the cruel chains of the town. The face of the corrupt official twisted into a mask of pure, highly volatile rage. He aggressively spurred his massive stallion, forcing the angry beast to step directly toward the stoic giant. Harrison did not flinch a single inch. A spoken claim in the dirt means absolutely nothing, hissed the official, his voice tight with deep frustration. The union is completely invalid without a registered legal certificate signed by an appointed county magistrate. The official violently turned his horse around, gesturing sharply for his heavily armed men to follow him back up the steep ridge. He paused directly at the edge of the deep depression, looking down at the massive protector and the deeply stunned seamstress. The nearest magistrate is 3 harsh days away. In the neighboring county of Blackwood, the official shouted coldly over his shoulder. I will return to this exact spot in exactly 3 days with the county sheriff. If you do not produce a signed, fully registered legal marriage certificate by sunset on the 3rd day, I will burn this broken cabin to the ground. Seize the water. And place the scarred woman in heavy iron chains. The riders spurred their heavy horses, charging violently back up the steep dirt trail, leaving a massive cloud of suffocating brown dust, completely choking the air of the valley. Harrison stood perfectly still until the final rider completely vanished over the high, jagged ridge. He turned his broad shoulders slowly, looking deeply down into the incredibly shocked face of the gentlewoman. He reached his heavily calloused hand forward, gently placing his massive palm directly against her trembling shoulder. It was a third, fiercely reassuring beat of absolute warmth. He did not look completely trapped by the massive declaration. He looked entirely resolved. However, the terrible reality of the brutal frontier remained highly unforgiving. The journey to the distant neighboring county was highly treacherous, deeply grueling, and completely exhausting. They had absolutely no time to mentally process the massive, life-altering shift in their relationship. The corrupt men had just forced them into a desperate, terrifying race against the ticking clock. If they failed to reach the distant town in time, the gentle seamstress would completely lose her freedom, and the towering protector would completely lose his life. The heavy wooden wheels of the wagon struck the frozen earth with violent, unrelenting force. The urgent journey to the distant settlement of Blackwood was a grueling, desperate race against the ticking clock of the corrupt town council. Harrison pushed the exhausted draft horses through the vast, freezing darkness of the frontier night, completely ignoring his own profound physical suffering. The severe limp of the towering cattle foreman translated into a deeply painful, rigid posture upon the hard wooden bench. Every single jarring rut in the brutal trail sent a visible tremor of absolute agony through the broad shoulders of the massive man. The cold wind howled violently down from the jagged northern ridges, biting mercilessly into the exposed skin of the weary travelers. Eleanor sat completely frozen beside the stoic giant. The overwhelming reality of the impending union pressed heavily against her chest. She fully expected the deeply isolated man to harbor immense, silent resentment toward the forced situation. He was sacrificing his entire way of life to protect a completely ruined outcast. Instead, the towering protector reached his heavy, calloused hand behind the wooden bench, retrieving the thick Navajo blanket. He meticulously tucked the heavy wool completely around the trembling shoulders of the scarred woman. He then intentionally shifted his massive, aching bulk directly into the path of the biting gale, acting as a human shield against the brutal weather. It was the absolute first beat of quiet warmth on the desperate trail. He was actively shielding his future bride from the harshness of the completely unforgiving world. The pale, weak morning sun finally illuminated the dusty, chaotic streets of the distant settlement. They halted the heavy wagon in front of the small wooden office of the county magistrate. Eleanor stood quietly in the back of the wagon, her trembling hands desperately attempting to brush the heavy trail dust from her faded green dress. The coarse cotton fabric was heavily mended, entirely lacking any form of delicate beauty or bridal grace. She engaged directly in her subtle, recurring habit. Her thumb and forefinger repeatedly smoothed the rough hem of her faded apron. A deep, suffocating wave of absolute inadequacy threatened to completely crush her gentle spirit. She was a deeply scarred, discarded commodity, preparing to legally bind herself to the most honorable, fiercely protective man she had ever encountered. She felt entirely unworthy of the profound sacrifice. Harrison waited patiently near the front of the heavy wagon. When the sturdy seamstress finally stepped down into the freezing mud of the street, the towering giant turned his massive body to face her. The piercing, deep-set blue eyes of the mountain man did not see the heavy dirt or the deeply faded fabric. He looked directly at the burn scar on her left cheek, and his stoic, guarded expression completely softened into a look of absolute, breathtaking reverence. It was a second, utterly shattering beat of emotional warmth. He looked at the gentle, scarred underdog as if she were absolute royalty, draped gracefully in the finest velvet of the entire world. He slowly offered his heavy, calloused hand, silently guiding her up the rough wooden steps with the profound respect of a devoted knight. The interior of the small legal office smelled vividly of stale pipe tobacco, dried black ink, and heavy, ancient dust. The county magistrate, an older man with tired, uncaring eyes, pulled a large leather ledger across the scratched wooden desk. The words of the binding ceremony were completely standard, recited with careless speed by the board official. Yet, as the traditional words hung heavily in the quiet, dusty air of the dim room, a profound emotional reflection blossomed fully within the soul of Eleanor. This moment was a truly sacred sacrifice. The massive man standing solidly beside her was intentionally trading his absolute, deeply guarded isolation to become a permanent, legal shield for a woman the entire society had entirely rejected. He was laying down his own quiet peace to ensure she would never be dragged away in heavy iron chains. In return, she was sacrificing the heavy, defensive walls she had built around her battered heart, completely trusting a massive stranger with the absolute entirety of her life. "Take her hand," muttered the tired magistrate, pointing a stained, ink-covered finger toward the quiet couple. Harrison turned his broad shoulders fully toward the gentle woman. He reached out and gently enclosed the small, trembling fingers of Eleanor completely within his massive, heavily calloused palms. The sudden, intense heat of his physical touch was a third, immense beat of deep emotional warmth. "I take thee to be my wedded wife," rumbled the deep, incredibly steady voice of the giant. He did not speak the words like a clever legal trick designed solely to defeat the corrupt men of the territory. He spoke the heavy vows with the immovable, absolute weight of a solid mountain. The deep, raw sincerity vibrating in his rumbling voice completely shattered the final remaining fears guarding the battered heart of the seamstress. "I take thee to be my wedded husband," whispered the gentlewoman, her warm hazel eyes filling rapidly with profound, unshed tears. The heavy iron pen of the magistrate scratched loudly across the thick parchment. The dark ink slowly dried in the cold air of the room. The vital legal certificate was completely finalized, heavily stamped with the official seal of the county. Harrison folded the precious paper meticulously, placing the document deeply into the inside pocket of his heavy canvas coat, directly over his beating heart. The absolute salvation of their hidden sanctuary and the freedom of the scarred woman were officially secured against the wrath of the world. They stepped together, back outside into the freezing, biting wind of the busy settlement. The desperate, burning adrenaline that had fueled the brutal, sleepless journey immediately began to completely drain away from their exhausted bodies. The crushing weight of the sudden safety allowed the grim reality of their physical limits to aggressively return. The immense physical toll of the relentless labor during the dust storm, completely combined with the deeply agonizing, continuous ride on the hard wooden bench, suddenly crashed violently over the massive frame of the stoic protector. They walked slowly toward the waiting draft horses. The sky above bruised rapidly into a deep, freezing twilight. Suddenly, the deep, ragged breath of the giant hitched violently in his broad chest. The deeply ruined leg of the cattle foreman completely buckled beneath his massive weight. The heavy leather boot of the man twisted awkwardly in the frozen mud of the street. Without a single sound of warning or a cry of pain, the towering mountain man collapsed heavily into the brutal dirt, his massive body lying completely motionless against the frozen earth. Eleanor dropped to her knees in the freezing mud, her heart screaming in absolute terror as she stared at the fallen giant. They possessed the vital paper to save their home, but she was now entirely alone in a strange, unforgiving town with a dangerously unconscious protector, and the brutal journey back to the sanctuary of Dead Man Creek seemed entirely impossible. The freezing mud of the desolate street clung heavily to the worn knees of Eleanor. She knelt in the bitter cold beside the massive, motionless form of the stoic protector. Panic, sharp and suffocating, attempted to violently seize her gentle heart. The vital legal document resting completely safe within the heavy coat of the giant meant absolutely nothing if the man himself perished in the frozen dirt of the foreign settlement. The towering mountain man was entirely incapacitated, his massive frame completely consumed by a sudden, violent fever raging relentlessly through his exhausted body. The cruel townspeople of the distant settlement walked quickly past the desperate scene, their eyes entirely averted, offering exactly zero assistance to the scarred outcast and the fallen stranger. Eleanor knew she could not physically lift the immense bulk of the massive cattle foreman. The cruel society of her past had constantly labeled her sturdy body as clumsy and slow, but the mind of the seasoned seamstress was highly practical, deeply resilient, and incredibly resourceful. She stood quickly, her warm hazel eyes scanning the heavy wooden wagon. She moved with fierce determination. She dragged the thick canvas tarp from the wooden bed of the wagon and spread the heavy fabric directly onto the freezing mud beside the fallen giant. With immense physical effort, she rolled the unyielding body of the silent protector onto the thick canvas. She secured thick leather ropes to the brass grommets of the tarp, throwing the opposite ends of the heavy lines over the elevated rear gate of the wagon and tying them directly to the heavy leather collar of the draft horse. She walked to the front of the massive beast. She stroked the thick neck of the animal and murmured a quiet, steady command. The strong horse stepped forward exactly 2 heavy paces. The heavy ropes pulled taut, sliding the thick canvas and the massive weight of the unconscious giant smoothly up the slanted wooden gate and safely onto the flat wooden bed of the wagon. It was a magnificent, desperate triumph of practical homemaking ingenuity over brute physical strength. Eleanor climbed quickly onto the high wooden bench. She took the heavy leather reins tightly into her own scarred hands. The freezing evening wind screamed violently as she turned the massive wagon toward the dark, treacherous trail leading back to the hidden valley. The journey was deeply terrifying. The night was absolutely pitch black. The deep, frozen ruts of the road threatened to violently overturn the heavy wooden wheels at every single turn. Yet, she drove relentlessly. The gentle, overlooked underdog pushed through the suffocating fear, refusing to allow the harsh wilderness to claim the life of the very man who had just sacrificed everything to save hers. By the deep hours of midnight, the fever of the giant spiked to a terrifying, deadly level. Eleanor halted the exhausted team of horses in a heavily sheltered, narrow dirt ravine. She climbed immediately into the back of the dark wagon. The vivid sensory contrast within the enclosed space was overwhelming. The intense, burning heat radiating aggressively from the skin of the massive man clashed violently against the freezing, biting air of the winter night. The heavy scent of deep sickness and sour fever sweat completely filled the tight space beneath the canvas roof. Eleanor engaged directly in her subtle, recurring habit. Her trembling thumb and forefinger rhythmically smoothed the rough hem of her faded apron, as she looked down at the shivering mountain of a man. The massive shoulders of Harrison trembled violently, his deep chest rising and falling in harsh, ragged gasps. The gentle woman did not hesitate. She removed the heavy, incredibly warm sheepskin coat from her own shoulders. She draped the thick wool directly over the broad chest of the deeply shivering protector, willingly sacrificing her own absolute physical comfort to shield him from the biting cold. It was the very first profound beat of warmth in the dark night. She retrieved a small iron pot, boiling fresh water over a tiny, carefully guarded fire built in the dirt of the ravine. Returning to the wagon Thuon, she knew she had to lower the terrible heat radiating from his heavily ruined leg. She carefully unfastened the thick denim fabric of his heavy trousers, pulling the reinforced cloth away from his right calf. The harsh, completely unvarnished truth of the brutal cattle stampede was finally, entirely revealed. Deep, jagged scars twisted violently across the thick muscles of his heavy leg. The deeply ruined flesh was a highly terrifying map of immense physical agony and impossible survival. He had hidden this terrible wound from the mocking pity of the entire world for many long years. Eleanor offered exactly zero pity. She possessed only profound, unshakable respect. She dipped a clean cotton cloth into the warm water. With absolute, breathtaking gentleness, she bathed the heavily scarred flesh of the deeply sleeping giant. It was a second, utterly magnificent beat of emotional warmth. She touched the deeply ruined, violently broken places of the mountain man with a soft, reverent tenderness he had never known in his entire life. Her gentle hands brought immediate, visible relief to the strained muscles of the protector. A deep, highly profound, emotional reflection washed completely over the tired soul of the seamstress. For 32 bitter years, the cruel town had constantly called her sturdy arms and broad back a miserable curse. Yet, those exact same sturdy arms had just hoisted a massive giant into a heavy wagon. Her steady hands had driven a massive team of horses through the freezing blackness of the desolate frontier. Her quiet, practical strength possessed the exact required gentleness to soothe a highly dangerous fever. She was not a worthless, discarded burden, merely being dragged along by a stronger savior. She was an absolute equal partner, completely capable of carrying the massive weight of their mutual survival when the strong legs of the towering protector finally failed. The profound shift from complete reliance to mutual physical permanently altered the very foundation of her battered spirit. As the absolute darkest hour of the night approached, the violent tremors of the intense fever worsened considerably. Eleanor climbed fully onto the rough wooden planks beside the massive man. She wrapped her sturdy arms completely around his broad shoulders, pulling his burning, heavily bearded face directly against her soft collarbone. She held him tightly against the freezing dark, becoming a solid, immovable physical anchor for his wandering spirit. It was a third, fiercely intimate beat of absolute warmth. The weak, pale dawn slowly began to break over the high ridges of the ravine. The violent shivering finally ceased, and the terrible heat of the fever slowly began to recede from the thick skin of the exhausted giant. The deep-set blue eyes of Harrison remained tightly closed against the morning light. However, his dry, chapped lips parted softly, completely trapped in the fading haze of the terrible delirium. The stoic protector spoke in a hoarse, deeply broken whisper. He murmured a deeply hidden, closely guarded secret regarding the day of the cruel auction, revealing the highly unexpected, true reason his massive boots had ever stepped onto the dusty streets of the town. The deeply confusing, feverish whisper of the giant remained a highly locked puzzle in the mind of the gentlewoman. During the darkest hour in the freezing ravine, the delirious mountain man had murmured a fragmented, impossible confession regarding the heavy gold on the day of the cruel auction. The gentle seamstress had completely brushed the broken words aside as the dark illusions of the terrible sickness, focusing entirely on driving the heavy wagon back to the sanctuary of Dead Man Creek. Weeks passed quickly, and the brutal grip of the frontier winter finally surrendered completely to the warm, golden light of the early spring. The miraculous underground spring entirely transformed the desolate valley. The pure, rushing water soaked deeply into the barren dirt, waking the sleeping seeds hidden far beneath the surface. Vibrant, incredibly bright green shoots of wild prairie grass pushed aggressively through the dark soil. The deeply ruined, completely worthless parcel of dead rock bloomed rapidly into a magnificent, deeply lush oasis. The profound physical transformation of the harsh landscape directly mirrored the absolute, beautiful awakening occurring within the scarred woman. The deeply buried spirit of Eleanor, previously crushed under 32 years of constant public mockery, began to finally stretch out and bloom. The warm hazel eyes of the gentle seamstress held a bright, steady light. She moved around the mended timber cabin with quiet, profound confidence, completely trusting the sturdy walls and the massive, silent protector who shared the bright space. They traveled together to the neutral supply post, located exactly halfway between their hidden sanctuary and the corrupt town. The heavy wagon needed vital spring seeds, thick iron nails, and heavy sacks of white flour. The interior of the bustling frontier mercantile was a vivid sensory explosion. The tight space smelled incredibly intensely of freshly roasted black coffee beans, sharp peppermint candy, dried salted pork, and heavily oiled saddle leather. Eleanor walked carefully beside the towering frame of Harrison. The severe limp of the cattle foreman remained highly visible, but the terrible fever was completely gone. His broad shoulders moved with immense, solid power as they approached the long wooden counter. A harsh, grating voice completely shattered the quiet peace of the morning. I see the crippled hermit managed to keep the heavy beast of burden alive through the deep freeze. Eleanor froze completely in the center of the wooden floor. The corrupt town official stood near the glowing iron stove, casually peeling a red apple with a small silver knife. The cruel, calculating eyes of the rat-like man swept over the sturdy figure of the seamstress with absolute, undisguised disgust. He had failed to steal the valuable land, and the deep, bitter resentment burned brightly in his sneering face. He deliberately raised his voice, ensuring every single patron inside the busy mercantile heard his deeply cruel insult. I suppose a heavily scarred laborer is useful for digging in the dead dirt, mocked the official loudly. Though it is a terrible shame about the face. A terrible fright for the honest patrons of this establishment. The heavy, suffocating weight of the old cruelty crashed violently back down upon the shoulders of the gentle underdog. The instinct to hide, to apologize for her physical existence, flared wildly in her beating heart. She engaged immediately in her subtle, recurring habit. Her trembling thumb and forefinger reached down, rhythmically smoothing the rough hem of her faded green apron. She prepared to lower her chin and accept the heavy humiliation, exactly as she had done for her entire bitter life. However, a massive, heavily calloused hand gently covered her trembling fingers, completely stopping the nervous movement. It was the absolute first beat of profound warmth. Harrison did not reach for the heavy revolver strapped to his thick thigh. The stoic protector simply stepped forward, positioning his massive, towering body directly beside the gentlewoman. He did not hide her behind his broad back. He stood shoulder to shoulder with her, refusing to let her shrink away from the cruel gaze of the room. He placed his massive hand firmly upon the small of her sturdy back, a deeply steadying, physical anchor of absolute support. "You are speaking to the legal, wedded wife of Harrison," rumbled the dangerous, incredibly deep voice of the giant. The heavy sound echoed loudly off the timber walls, completely silencing the bustling mercantile. "You will address her with absolute respect, or you will leave this establishment immediately," the corrupt official sneered, though his pale hands trembled slightly around the silver knife. A legal paper does not magically change a purchased, ugly commodity into a respectable lady of the society. Harrison took one single, highly deliberate step toward the glowing stove. The immense, terrifying physical presence of the silent mountain man seemed to completely consume the air in the small room. The deep-set blue eyes of the protector burned with a fierce, absolute fire. "She is the absolute finest woman in this entire territory," declared the towering giant, his voice ringing with absolute, immovable truth. Her deeply scarred hands built a home from complete ruin. Her immense strength saved my life in the freezing dark. She possesses more absolute grace and profound beauty than any hollow soul sitting in your corrupt town council. You will apologize to my wife, or I will throw you through the heavy glass of that front window." The absolute, devastating public validation struck the battered heart of Eleanor like a magnificent, blinding sunrise. It was, say second, utterly shattering beat of emotional warmth. He was actively demanding the absolute respect of the entire world on her behalf. He was, proudly, loudly claiming her sturdy figure, and her heavily scarred face as completely beautiful and entirely precious. The official swallowed heavily, his pale face draining of all color under the terrifying glare of the massive giant. The cruel man muttered a quick, completely terrified apology, dropping the silver knife and fleeing rapidly through the heavy wooden door of the mercantile. Harrison turned his broad shoulders completely back to Eleanor. The fierce, terrifying fire in his blue eyes vanished instantly, entirely replaced by a look of profound, gentle devotion. He reached out and carefully tucked a loose strand of light brown hair behind her ear, completely ignoring the staring eyes of the other patrons. It was a third, fiercely intimate beat of absolute warmth, a deep, magnificent emotional reflection, completely settled into the soul of the scarred woman. She was finally safe. She was no longer an unwanted burden hiding in the dark shadows. The absolute protection of the massive giant had completely solidified her deep emotional dependence upon him. She belonged entirely to the quiet sanctuary of Dead Man Creek, and her gentle heart belonged entirely to the deeply wounded, fiercely honorable man standing beside her. The heavy silence of the mercantile was broken by the quiet, shuffling steps of the old postmaster. The man stepped carefully out from the back room, holding a thick, incredibly crisp white parchment envelope. The thick paper bore the bright red, heavy wax seal of a deeply wealthy Eastern bank. "This arrived on the morning stagecoach," muttered the old postmaster, sliding the heavy envelope across the scratched wooden counter. "It is addressed directly to the seamstress." Addressed directly to Eleanor. The gentlewoman stared at the pristine white envelope. A highly unexpected, terrible chill crept slowly down her spine. She reached out with trembling fingers, breaking the heavy wax seal. Inside the thick parchment rested a massive, completely unbelievable sum of perfectly crisp paper money. Tucked neatly beside the immense wealth was a formal, heavily written letter from a wealthy, distant relative in the civilized East. The crisp ink detailed a complete, open offer of safe passage, a beautiful house in a high society neighborhood, and the absolute promise of a highly comfortable, wealthy life entirely away from the brutal, freezing dirt of the western frontier. The incredibly crisp white parchment trembled violently in the sturdy hands of Eleanor. The stark, black ink of the wealthy Eastern relative spelled out a massive, highly impossible promise. The letter described a beautiful, elegant home in the civilized East. It offered a highly comfortable existence, completely free from heavy physical labor, bitter, freezing cold, and the endless, heavy dirt of the frontier. The massive sum of perfectly crisp paper money, tucked securely inside the thick envelope, was more than enough to purchase absolute, unquestionable independence. The gentle seamstress looked up slowly from the heavy paper, her warm hazel eyes seeking the steady, comforting gaze of her towering husband. She fully expected to find shared triumph, or perhaps a quiet, amused dismissal of the distant offer. Instead, she found an absolute, terrifying wall of freezing, impenetrable stone. The deep-set blue eyes of Harrison were entirely devoid of the fierce, deeply protective fire that had burned so brightly only moments before. He stared directly at the thick stack of paper money, and a dark, highly devastating shadow of absolute unworthiness completely consumed his heavily bearded face. He looked slowly down at his own heavy, dirt-stained canvas coat. He looked at his heavily ruined right leg, the permanent, ugly manifestation of his violent, physical brokenness. Then, he looked directly at the radiant, rapidly healing face of the beautiful woman standing entirely quiet beside him. The terrible, crushing conclusion forming rapidly behind his stoic mask was highly visible and deeply heartbreaking. The deeply wounded giant truly believed a heavily scarred, limping foreman, living on a dirt farm, was completely inadequate for the magnificent, valuable woman she was quickly becoming. He turned his broad shoulders away completely. He did not speak a single syllable as he walked heavily toward the long wooden counter of the mercantile to finalize the heavy supply order. Before placing the massive sack of white flour onto his broad shoulder, the towering cattle foreman reached carefully into his heavy leather pouch. He retrieved one single, highly polished silver coin and placed it quietly upon the scratched glass of the display case. He pointed a heavily calloused finger directly at a beautiful, highly delicate spool of bright blue silk ribbon. He handed the elegant silk directly to the quiet seamstress without looking into her eyes. It was the absolute first beat of terrible, deeply aching warmth. He was actively purchasing a beautiful luxury for her, a highly delicate offering of his absolute devotion, exactly at the very moment he was mentally preparing to completely let her walk out of his lonely life. The long wagon ride back to the hidden sanctuary of Dead Man Creek was entirely suffocating. The vivid sensory creak of the heavy wooden wheels, turning relentlessly against the dry, hardened dirt, completely dominated the absolute silence stretching violently between the two companions. The physical distance upon the hard wooden bench felt as impossibly wide as a massive ocean. Harrison sat entirely rigid, his broad shoulders hunched deeply against an invisible, heavily crushing weight. He did not intentionally shift his massive body to shield her from the biting afternoon wind as he had always done in the past. He simply stared blankly into the vast, empty horizon, deeply lost in the terrible agony of his own heavily burdened mind. Eleanor sat completely frozen on the edge of the heavy bench, her gentle heart twisting in deep, profound agony. She engaged desperately in her subtle, recurring habit. Her trembling thumb and forefinger violently smoothed the rough hem of her faded green apron over and over again. The beautiful, defied, radiant joy of the victorious morning was entirely shattered. The profound emotional reflection of a highly seasoned storyteller must pause directly here to acknowledge a terrible, universal human tragedy. The absolute greatest danger to a deeply wounded soul is not the cruel judgment of the outside world. The greatest danger is the terrifying, highly destructive fear of sudden unworthiness. The towering giant had bravely faced a violent, howling dust storm. He had aggressively confronted deeply corrupt, highly dangerous armed men. He had risked his absolute life and his heavily guarded freedom without a single moment of hesitation. Yet, the simple piece of crisp white paper offering his gentle wife a better, easier life completely defeated him. The highly honorable mountain man was completely paralyzed by the intense, terrifying fear that his deep love was a heavy anchor dragging her down into the terrible dirt. When the heavy wooden wagon finally halted beside the newly mended timber cabin, the weak afternoon sun was sinking rapidly behind the jagged western ridge. Harrison climbed heavily down from the bench, the severe limp causing a visible tremor in his thick thigh. He turned his massive body and reached up, placing his heavily calloused hands firmly upon the sturdy waist of Eleanor to guide her safely down to the soft earth. As her sturdy leather boots touched the damp dirt, his massive hands lingered exactly 1 second longer than strictly necessary. It was a second test, utterly desperate beat of intense emotional warmth. His incredibly strong fingers gripped the thick fabric of her coarse dress with intense, silent longing. It was a heavy, completely wordless goodbye from a deeply broken man who truly believed he was performing a highly noble, necessary sacrifice for her absolute happiness. He immediately stepped back, severing the vital physical connection completely. He carried the heavy sacks of white flour and the thick iron nails into the dark interior of the cabin. Eleanor followed quietly, the thick envelope of Eastern money burning a terrible, agonizing hole inside the deep pocket of her apron. Inside the dim room, the mountain man knelt heavily before the cold stones of the hearth. He meticulously arranged the dry pine kindling, striking a small wooden match to summon a bright, roaring fire. He remained near the growing flames just long enough to ensure the absolute maximum heat radiated directly toward the sturdy wooden bed of the seamstress. It was a third, fiercely protective beat of absolute warmth. He was actively ensuring her complete physical comfort, completely ignoring his own profound emotional freezing. He stood up, slowly, the heavy drag of his ruined leg sounding unusually loud in the quiet, heavily tense room. He did not look directly into her warm hazel eyes. The stagecoach leaves the settlement for the Eastern Rail Line in exactly 2 days, rumbled the deep, entirely hollow voice of the giant. Eleanor stared entirely at his broad back, the breath completely leaving her lungs. Why are you speaking of the stagecoach? The money is more than enough to purchase safe passage and secure a highly comfortable life in the civilized cities, stated the towering cattle foreman, his deep words completely devoid of all natural emotion. You possess the required funds to finally leave the heavy dirt, the freezing wind, and the cruel mockery. You do not belong in a broken timber cabin with a ruined, limping foreman. You will pack your belongings tomorrow morning. He turned away, immediately, stepping heavily toward the heavy wooden door, fully intending to spend the cold night out in the dark barn with the heavy draft horses. He was entirely willing to sacrifice his own absolute happiness, condemning himself to a lifetime of bitter loneliness, to ensure she received the wealthy, easy life he deeply believed she completely deserved. The intense longing, the terrible jealousy of the unknown Eastern life, and the deeply terrifying fear of losing the gentle underdog had completely consumed the stoic protector. However, the fierce, heavily tested survival instinct of the gentle seamstress finally roared violently to life. Eleanor did not shrink away. She moved with sudden, explosive speed. She stepped directly into the path of the massive giant, planting her sturdy leather boots firmly against the dirt floor. She placed her small, scarred hands entirely flat against the heavy, immovable canvas of his broad chest, physically blocking his exit from the sanctuary. "Do you truly wish for me to leave this valley?" demanded the gentlewoman, her voice trembling with intense, highly raw emotion. "Look directly into my face, Harrison. Look at the scars of my past and tell me you truly want me to walk away from this home." The heavy silence inside the broken timber cabin stretched to an absolute, terrifying breaking point. Eleanor stood completely immovable, her small, scarred hands pressed flat against the broad, heaving chest of the towering cattle foreman. She could feel the violent, rapid thudding of his heavy heart beneath the thick canvas coat. The gentle seamstress engaged instantly in her subtle, recurring habit. Her right thumb and forefinger dropped momentarily to fiercely smooth the rough hem of her faded green apron, gathering every single ounce of her deep courage. She placed her trembling hands right back against the solid warmth of his chest. "Look directly into my face," she demanded again, her voice ringing with absolute, fierce clarity over the crackling flames of the stone hearth. "Look directly at me and tell me you truly wish for me to board that stagecoach." The massive mountain man remained entirely rigid. His deep-set blue eyes stared fixedly at the rough timber wall directly over her head. The intense physical proximity of her sturdy, warm body was a profound agony for a man actively attempting to sever his own deeply wounded heart. He opened his mouth, fully intending to issue a harsh, final command designed completely to protect her from his own perceived brokenness. But the absolute truth of his deep, overwhelming devotion violently refused to form the cruel words. A heavy, broken sound escaped the back of his throat. He spun away violently, the sudden movement causing his heavily ruined leg to drag painfully against the dirt floor. His massive, calloused hand lashed out in deep, profound frustration. He heavily struck the rough stone mantel of the hearth. The violent impact sent the ornate mahogany box, the mysterious object they had discovered hidden beneath the floorboards on their very first morning, crashing heavily onto the hard stones. The loud, sharp sound of splintering dark wood and snapping metal echoed loudly through the small room. The ancient, rusted brass lock finally shattered completely. The beautiful wooden lid flipped fully open upon the dirt floor. A vivid sensory wave immediately filled the tight space. The deeply rich, sweet scent of completely dried, ancient rose petals and highly aged parchment floated upward, completely overpowering the familiar smell of the burning pine. Eleanor dropped slowly to her knees, entirely ignoring the heavy dust. She reached out with trembling fingers, carefully lifting a small bundle of letters tied tightly with a highly faded red ribbon. Harrison stood completely frozen near the open door, his broad chest heaving heavily. He watched the gentlewoman untie the delicate ribbon. She unfolded the first thick parchment. The ink was heavily faded, but the elegant, sprawling script was entirely legible. Eleanor began to read aloud, her warm hazel voice wrapping gently around the harsh silence of the room. The letters were a profound, deeply intimate record of the very first souls who had dared to build a life in the desolate valley of Dead Man Creek. The writer was a pioneer woman, and the words were addressed directly to her husband. She wrote of terrible, freezing winters, failed crops, and deep, aching physical hunger. Doc. Yet, the words held absolutely zero regret. The pioneer woman described the heavy, calloused hands of her husband as her absolute greatest treasure. She wrote that a massive palace made of solid gold in the civilized East could never equal the profound safety of his protective embrace in the freezing dark. They possessed absolutely nothing of worldly value. Yet, they possessed absolutely everything, because they held firmly onto each other. A profound emotional reflection blossomed entirely within the quiet soul of the scarred woman. The beautiful letters were an absolute, magnificent testament to the core pillar of second chances. The past inhabitants had built a deeply loving home, not with heavy gold, but with fierce, absolute devotion. Now, decades later, a heavily scarred underdog and a deeply broken, limping giant were standing directly, in the exact same footprint, receiving a beautiful second chance to rewrite the harsh ending of the valley. Their physical flaws and their heavy pasts were not terrible burdens. They were the exact solid foundation upon which a truly unbreakable love could finally be constructed. Harrison slowly turned his broad shoulders. He walked heavily back across the dirt floor, the agonizing drag of his injured leg sounding entirely vulnerable in the quiet room. He lowered his massive frame directly beside her, kneeling awkwardly upon the hard stones. He reached out, covering her small, trembling hand entirely with his massive, dirt-stained palm as she held the final letter. It was the absolute first beat of profound warmth. His touch was incredibly gentle, completely anchoring her directly to the present moment. "They survived the terrible winter," whispered Eleanor, looking deeply into the blue eyes of the giant. She did not care about his lack of gold. She only wanted his presence. The stoic mask of the fiercely protective cattle foreman, finally, completely shattered. The intense emotional vulnerability he had hidden carefully for many years broke completely open. "I cannot offer you the civilized safety of the East," rumbled the deep voice of the giant, his words completely stripped of all harsh defense. "I walk with a severe limp. I have lived entirely in the dark shadows to hide my brokenness. But when you arrived, you brought absolute life to the dead dirt. You brought absolute light to my deeply ruined heart. I am utterly terrified of failing you." It was a second, utterly magnificent beat of emotional warmth. The most intimidating, powerful man in the entire Western Territory was openly admitting his absolute deepest fear, actively placing his highly fragile, battered heart directly into the incredibly capable hands of the seamstress. Eleanor did not hesitate. She dropped the ancient parchment onto the dirt. She reached up with both hands, placing her warm, sturdy palms directly against the heavily bearded, deeply scarred cheeks of the massive man. It was a third, fiercely intimate beat of absolute warmth. "My home is not in the wealthy cities of the East," breathed the gentle woman, her voice vibrating with absolute, undeniable truth. "My home is exactly wherever you stand. I do not want the paper money. I only want the man who stood firmly between me and the violent dust storm." The deep-set eyes of Harrison burned with a fierce, profound longing. He leaned his massive face forward, the heavy distance between them closing rapidly to a mere breath. The heavy walls of their profound emotional isolation were entirely breached. The absolute confession of their deep love hung heavily, beautifully in the warm air, mere seconds away from complete physical culmination. But the deeply earned, beautiful moment violently shattered. A harsh, sharp smell aggressively invaded the quiet sanctuary. The vivid sensory odor of incredibly heavy, bitter smoke violently burned the back of their throats. It was not the sweet scent of the pine logs inside the hearth. It was the terrifying, highly acidic smell of burning sagebrush and dry prairie grass. Eleanor gasped sharply, her warm hazel eyes widening in absolute terror as she looked directly past the broad shoulder of the giant. A thick, completely unnatural orange glow flickered violently against the single glass window of the newly mended cabin. The corrupt official had explicitly promised absolute destruction if they did not surrender the valuable land, and the brutal men of the town council had finally arrived under the absolute cover of the creeping darkness. The dry brush at the absolute edge of their fragile sanctuary was burning wildly, and a massive, roaring wall of lethal fire was rapidly closing in to completely consume everything they had miraculously built. The violent, completely unnatural, orange light bled aggressively through the single glass window of the mended cabin. The beautiful, profoundly vulnerable moment of absolute emotional surrender was instantly obliterated by the brutal reality of the harsh frontier. The sanctuary of Dead Man Creek was under direct, lethal attack. The vivid sensory smell of burning sagebrush and incinerated pine rapidly choked the breathable air inside the small room. Here, the roaring, highly terrifying crackle of an advancing wildfire completely drowned out the gentle sound of the bubbling spring. The corrupt men of the town council had explicitly promised absolute destruction, and they had finally delivered their cruel wrath under the deep cover of the creeping darkness. Harrison moved with explosive, terrifying speed. The highly tender, emotionally open man vanished completely, instantly replaced by the highly lethal, fiercely protective cattle foreman. He lunged across the dirt floor, his massive hands reaching directly for the heavy leather holster hanging from the sturdy wooden chair. He did not bother to secure the heavy weapon to his thick thigh. He held the massive iron revolver firmly in his heavily calloused grip. He stepped aggressively toward the heavy timber door, completely placing his massive frame between the roaring threat and the gentle seamstress. It was the absolute first beat of fierce warmth. He instinctively transformed his own massive body into a physical shield, ensuring the dangerous flames would have to burn completely through him before they could ever reach the deeply scarred woman. He kicked the heavy wooden door violently open. A massive, suffocating wave of intense heat and thick black smoke immediately struck them like a heavy physical blow. The entire western edge of the hidden valleys was completely consumed by a towering wall of angry orange fire. The dry prairie grass, heavily starved of moisture for many years, acted as explosive fuel for the aggressive flames. The bitter evening wind pushed the roaring fire directly toward the wooden corral and the fragile timber walls of the newly mended cabin. High upon the jagged ridge, barely visible through the swirling black smoke, the dark silhouette of a mounted saboteur watched the terrible destruction unfold. "Stay directly behind me," roared the giant, his deep voice cutting fiercely through the violent noise of the raging fire. Eleanor followed closely behind the broad back of the stoic protector, coughing heavily as the bitter ash stung her warm hazel eyes. She engaged entirely in her subtle, recurring habit. Her trembling thumb and forefinger desperately smoothed the rough hem of her faded green apron. A profound, highly agonizing emotional reflection violently seized her beating heart. The corrupt, cruel society that had completely discarded her was now actively attempting to destroy the absolute only place where she possessed genuine value. The cruel men could not tolerate the beautiful salvation of the heavily scarred underdog. They completely intended to burn her newly dignity right back down to the dead dirt. The roaring flames rapidly reached the dry wooden posts of the heavy corral. Harrison realized instantly that the violent fire could not be stopped by heavy bullets. If the hungry flames reached the dry timber roof of the small cabin, they would completely lose the absolute only home they possessed. The towering cattle foreman knew exactly what brutal action was completely necessary. He holstered the heavy weapon. He turned his broad shoulders swiftly toward the gentle woman. He moved rapidly to the safe eastern side of the yard, grabbing the thick leather halter of the massive draft horse. He led the highly panicked, heavy beast directly toward Eleanor. The mountain man reached out, wrapping his immensely strong arms completely around the sturdy waist of the seamstress. With incredible, desperate strength, he lifted her full figure entirely off the damp ground, placing her securely upon the broad back of the heavy draft horse. "Take the reins," commanded the towering protector, his voice tight with absolute, terrifying desperation. "Ride directly east toward the neutral settlement. Do not look back. Do not stop until you reach the heavy safety of the distant town." Eleanor stared down at the heavily bearded face of the giant, her heart screaming in complete, suffocating terror. She saw the absolute, devastating resolve burning fiercely in his deep-set blue eyes. He fully intended to physically fight the roaring wall of fire to save the home she had meticulously built. It was a completely suicidal task for a massively heavy man burdened by a deeply ruined, agonizing leg. Harrison reached rapidly up, stripping the heavy canvas coat from his own broad shoulders. He draped the thick, protective garment completely over her trembling form to physically shield her from the violently flying embers. It was a second, utterly heartbreaking beat of profound warmth. He was actively stripping away his absolute last layer of physical defense to ensure she survived the treacherous journey. He placed his heavy, calloused hand firmly against her scarred cheek. He leaned heavily forward, pressing his warm forehead directly against her trembling hands. It was a third, fiercely intimate beat of absolute warmth. "You possess the crisp paper money of your wealthy family," breathed the mountain man, his deep voice breaking completely under the immense weight of the sacred sacrifice. "Use the heavy gold to reach the civilized East. You are the absolute finest, most beautiful soul I have ever known. Now, ride." He violently struck the heavy flank of the draft horse, urging the beast forward. Harrison immediately turned away. He charged directly toward the roaring wall of lethal fire. The towering giant threw his massive, unprotected body heavily against the burning timber of the corral. He began violently tearing the heavy, flaming logs apart with his bare, calloused hands, desperately attempting to create a wide gap to stop the advancing destruction. Within mere seconds, the highly suffocating, thick black smoke completely swallowed the massive frame of the stoic protector. The draft horse moved nervously toward the safe eastern trail. Eleanor sat highly elevated upon the strong back of the animal. Her trembling fingers brushed against the deep pocket of her apron, feeling the crisp, thick envelope of wealthy Eastern money. The civilized cities offered complete, absolute physical safety. The cruel town council could never reach her there. Yet, the fierce, newly awakened spirit of the gentle underdog absolutely refused to flee. What value did completely safe, highly civilized wealth hold if she abandoned the remarkably honorable man who had openly claimed her scarred face as absolute beauty? She was no longer a terrified, discarded commodity running blindly from the cruel mockery of the world. She was the highly capable, deeply loyal wife of Harrison. Eleanor violently pulled back upon the heavy leather reins, completely halting the massive draft horse. She slid rapidly down from the heavy back of the animal, dropping the crisp envelope of Eastern money entirely into the dark mud. She ran desperately toward the bubbling underground spring. She grabbed the incredibly thick, heavy Navajo blanket resting upon the porch. She plunged the heavy wool completely into the freezing, pure water of the deep basin until the thick fabric was absolutely soaked. The heat of the advancing fire was completely unbearable, heavily blistering the exposed skin of her arms. The gentle seamstress gripped the wet, heavy blanket tightly in her sturdy hands. She took one final, incredibly deep breath of the remaining clean air, entirely refusing the final, desperate order of her towering husband. The fiercely loyal woman plunged directly into the roaring, violently swirling black smoke to find her massive protector. The completely suffocating, incredibly thick black smokes swallowed the sturdy frame of Eleanor the moment she breached the roaring wall of fire. The intense, this highly volatile heat violently blistered the exposed air, completely searing her lungs with every single desperate breath. She held the heavy, freezing wet Navajo blanket tightly against her chest, her leather boots pounding aggressively against the burning earth. She entirely ignored the highly terrifying roar of the angry flames, her warm hazel eyes searching frantically through the dark, swirling ash for the massive silhouette of the stoic protector. She found him exactly at the eastern corner of the fragile cabin. The towering cattle foreman was actively attempting to drag a massive, violently burning timber away from the dry wooden wall of their home. The immense physical strain upon his broad shoulders was highly visible, and his deeply ruined leg had completely buckled beneath the terrible weight. He was trapped against the blazing log, the destructive flames licking aggressively toward his thick, heavily bearded face. Eleanor did not hesitate a single second. She threw herself aggressively forward, launching the thick, highly soaked wool of the Navajo blanket directly over the burning timber and the heavily exposed arms of the giant. The vivid sensory sound of a massive, violent hiss echoed sharply as the freezing spring water violently collided with the extreme heat of the fire. A thick cloud of white steam erupted instantly into the dark night, rapidly choking the advancing flames. It was the absolute first beat of profound warmth in the chaotic destruction. She was actively using her unique, life-saving homemaker knowledge to literally extinguish the deadly threat entirely aimed at her husband. Harrison gasped violently, tearing his massive frame away from the smoldering log. He looked completely shocked to see the gentle seamstress standing firmly in the absolute center of the dangerous fire. Before he could utter a harsh reprimand regarding her absolute refusal to flee, Eleanor stepped directly beside him. She wrapped her sturdy arms securely around his thick waist, lending her absolute, highly dependable physical strength to support his exhausted body. Together, they relentlessly pushed the smoldering timber completely away from the wooden wall, officially breaking the violent line of the advancing fire. The harsh, biting wind suddenly shifted, blowing the thick black smoke aggressively back toward the high ridge. High upon the jagged dirt path, the mounted saboteur violently yanked the heavy leather reins of his horse, attempting to flee into the deep darkness. However, a sudden, explosive shower of bright orange sparks violently spooked the massive beast. The terrified horse reared aggressively upward, violently throwing the dark rider directly onto the hardened, rocky earth of the trail. Harrison immediately separated himself from the gentle support of his wife. The towering giant drew his massive iron revolver, his severe limp completely forgotten beneath the overwhelming rush of pure, protective adrenaline. He charged aggressively up the steep incline, the heavy weapon leveled perfectly at the chest of the fallen man. Within exactly 10 seconds, the powerful protector dragged the highly terrified, ash-covered saboteur down into the center of the dark yard, throwing the cowardly man heavily onto the dirt. It was the right-hand enforcer of the corrupt town official, completely caught in the terrible act of attempted destruction. Harrison quickly bound the wrists of the saboteur with a thick leather rope, securing the dangerous man tightly to the surviving wooden post of the corral. The immediate, lethal threat was completely extinguished. The miraculous underground spring had provided the exact weapon required to defeat the cruel fire. The small timber cabin remained absolutely standing, its strong wooden walls entirely unburned in the center of the blackened, heavily scarred yard. A profound, incredibly heavy silence slowly descended upon the completely exhausted valley. The dark sky rained soft, gray ash down upon the two survivors. Harrison turned his broad shoulders slowly. His massive, heavily soiled face was completely pale beneath the thick layer of dark soot. He dropped heavily onto his good knee directly in front of Eleanor. He reached out with heavily trembling, calloused hands, quickly running his fingers over her coarse green dress to desperately ensure she was completely unharmed by the violent flames. It was a second, utterly desperate beat of immense emotional warmth. He was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps, utterly terrified by the horrific thought that he had almost lost her to the fire. "I ordered you to ride to the civilized safety," breathed the giant, his deep voice cracking violently with raw, highly exposed emotion. "Why did you refuse to run?" Eleanor stood completely still in the falling ash. She engaged immediately in her subtle, recurring habit. Her small, deeply scarred fingers reached down, rhythmically smoothing the rough, heavily charred hem of her faded apron. "I possess absolutely no desire to live in a highly civilized mansion completely without you," whispered the gentlewoman, her warm hazel eyes locking directly onto his fierce gaze. "You saved my life from the cruel mockery. You gave me absolute dignity. I completely refuse to let the corrupt men burn our hard-earned peace to the dead ground." Harrison stared up at her deeply scarred, completely beautiful face. The absolute, heavy realization of her unwavering loyalty shattered the very last defensive wall guarding his highly battered heart. He slowly reached into the deep pocket of his canvas coat, his heavy fingers brushing against the perfectly safe, legally binding marriage certificate. He looked deeply into her eyes, preparing to reveal the massive, completely life-altering secret he had kept tightly locked away since the freezing ride from the town. "You believe I purchased you simply because you were bundled with this land," rumbled the mountain man, his deep voice carrying the heavy, absolute resonance of pure truth. "You believe the barren dirt was my primary goal, and you were simply a heavily broken addition." Eleanor nodded slightly, the old insecurity attempting briefly to return. "I never cared about Dead Man Creek," declared Harrison heavily. "I possessed absolutely no knowledge of the underground spring. The dead dirt was entirely worthless to me." The gentle seamstress completely froze, her breath catching violently in her throat. "Then, why did you throw your heavy gold upon the barrel?" Harrison gently lifted his massive hands, entirely cupping her dirt-stained face in his calloused palms. It was a third, utterly magnificent beat of highly vulnerable warmth. "I watched you for exactly 3 years from the dark shadows of the town," confessed the towering protector, the profound revelation pouring beautifully from his deeply wounded soul. "I watched the cruel townspeople mock your sturdy figure. I watched them stare violently at your heavily scarred cheek. Yet, I also watched you quietly mend the torn coat of a starving beggar in the freezing snow. I watched your absolute, quiet dignity entirely outshine the cruelty of the entire territory. You were the absolute most magnificent, deeply brave woman I had ever seen." The tears rapidly filled the warm hazel eyes of Eleanor, leaving clean tracks through the heavy, gray ash upon her cheeks. "When I heard the corrupt council was forcefully placing you upon the auction block, I rode directly down from the high ridges," continued the giant, his blue eyes shining with absolute, profound devotion. "I attended that highly cruel public joke specifically for you, Eleanor. I threw my entire fortune upon the barrel, solely to secure your absolute freedom. You were never the deeply rejected commodity. You were the absolute only prize I ever truly desired. The profound emotional progression was completely absolute. The core mystery was entirely revealed, thoroughly shattering the final illusion of the scarred underdog. The cruel society had labeled her completely worthless. But the most honorable man in the Western Territory had quietly, deeply cherished her entire existence for years. It was the ultimate, completely fulfilling validation. She surrendered her heart completely, leaning deeply into the massive, calloused palms of her loving husband. However, the beautiful, deeply cathartic moment was violently interrupted by the heavy, incredibly loud sound of approaching iron wheels. A massive group of heavy wagons and heavily armed men crested the jagged eastern ridge, drawn rapidly by the massive light of the violent fire. At the absolute front of the group rode the county sheriff, highly demanding immediate answers. They had easily captured the dangerous saboteur, but the deeply corrupt official had directly ordered the legal destruction of the sanctuary. The fragile fate of their highly contested land deed, and the absolute permanent future of their heavily beating hearts, hung completely unresolved in the dark, smoky air. The heavy, iron-rimmed wheels of the official wagons crunched loudly through the cooling ash. The county sheriff, a man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen far too much frontier misery, stepped down from his lead mount. He walked slowly toward the center of the yard, his gaze moving from the massive, soot-covered frame of Harrison to the sturdy, unwavering figure of Eleanor. Beside them, the saboteur remained tightly bound to the corral post, his head hanging in total, cowed defeat. The corrupt town official was nowhere to be found. Having fled the moment the fire began to turn, Harrison did not move. He stood perfectly still, his broad shoulders squared, his massive hand resting protectively on the small of the back of his wife. He did not need to shout. The sheer, immovable gravity of his presence spoke for him. The sheriff looked at the bound saboteur, then at the smoking remnants of the fence, and finally at the legally binding marriage certificate that Harrison produced from his heavy coat. The legal weight of the document, combined with the presence of a witness who had watched the official order the illegal burning, sealed the fate of the land. "The case is closed," the sheriff muttered, his voice gravelly and weary. "The official is stripped of his title. This land, and the spring beneath it, belongs to you and your wife by absolute legal right." The officials and the wagons eventually retreated, leaving the valley in a profound, heavy silence. The orange glow of the fire had completely died away, leaving only the smell of charred earth and the cooling night air. Eleanor turned toward the man who had fought the world to give her a home. She saw the absolute exhaustion etched into the deep lines of his face, the way his ruined leg trembled with the effort of simply remaining upright. The realization of his sacrifice, the years of secret watching, the daring auction, the dangerous journey, and the brutal fight against the fire, was a physical ache in her chest. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she brushed a smudge of soot from his thick, gray-streaked beard. It was the first beat of peaceful, earned warmth. The war was over. The cruel society had failed to break them. "We are finally safe," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Harrison leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. He did not say a word, but the deep, steady pulse of his heart against her palm was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. This was the harvest of their hearts, a life built on mutual reliance, profound respect, and an unbreakable, earned devotion. The following weeks brought a quiet, healing grace to the valley. The spring water, now channeled carefully into deep irrigation furrows, transformed the blackened yard into a blooming garden of vibrant color. Eleanor and Harrison worked side by side, their movements perfectly synchronized. She managed the domestic sanctuary, her capable hands sewing curtains for the cabin and tending the young vegetable sprouts. He managed the heavy labor, the restoration of the corrals, and the protection of their borders. The recurring habit of Eleanor, her thumb and forefinger smoothing her apron, gradually vanished, replaced by a confident, steady strength she had never known she possessed. She was no longer an underdog. She was the heart of the valley. One golden afternoon, they stood on the front porch of their fully repaired home. The air was filled with the sweet, clean scent of blooming sage and rushing water. Harrison stood behind her, his massive arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting gently on her shoulder. He was no longer the isolated hermit of the ridges. He was a man anchored by the love of a woman who saw the beauty beneath his scars. Eleanor leaned back into his immense, solid frame, her hands resting over his massive wrists. "You never truly left the shadows," she murmured, gazing out over the lush, green valley that stretched toward the horizon. "You were simply waiting for the right person to see you." Harrison tightened his hold, a low, rumbling sound of contentment vibrating in his chest. "I was waiting for you, Eleanor. I have been waiting for you for a long, long time." The profound emotional catharsis washed over them both, as steady and sure as the spring water flowing beneath their feet. They had found belonging in the most desolate of places, and they had found worthiness in the eyes of the one person who mattered most. The lesson was clear. Healing is not found in fleeing to an easier life, but in the courage to plant roots in the dirt of one's own reality and cultivate beauty from the ashes. Their love was not a fairy tale. It was a deeply earned, sturdy structure, built with the same resilience that had saved them from the freezing wind and the roaring fire. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the garden, Eleanor turned in his arms. She looked up at the towering man who had once terrified the entire town, but now held her with such profound, shattering gentleness. She reached up, pulling his head down toward hers. Their first true, unforced kiss was the absolute final, enduring beat of warmth. It was a promise of a lifetime, a quiet vow that no matter what storms or fires the future might hold, they would face the horizon together. The wind sighed through the valley, carrying the promise of a long, peaceful summer. They stood there as the stars began to blink into existence above the high, silent ridges. Two broken people who had stitched their lives together into something perfectly, beautifully whole. The barren land was no longer Dead Man Creek. It was their sanctuary, their legacy, and their hard-won home. And in the silence of the valley, for the first time in her life, the scarred seamstress knew exactly who she was. She was the lady of the valley, the beloved wife of a mountain man, and a woman who had finally, truly, come home. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is entirely coincidental.